Rudeus Greyrat and Subaru Natsuki get bad reputations on the internet. Both get a lot of flack outside of their respective fan bases. It's brought up a lot of the misguided ideas that surround both of these protagonists, and more so Rudy than Subaru. Characterizations that I find to be mindless, banal, and ignorant, so I figured I'd dive into these characters themselves and how they're put together to make some of the most fantastically detailed characters in anime, because I find it unfair that they get so much hate. He is not the ideal hero, but he has come remarkably far, and if you can't appreciate the effort he has made to change himself, well, maybe you should be a little bit less judgmental. And that finally brings me around to the other subject of this project, Subaru Natsuki.
お前の相手は俺だ。俺より前に行かせねえし、俺の先にいる子に追いつかせるわけにも絶対にいかねえ。夏希さん、そんなに僕のこと。ちょっと黙っててくれる？今カッコつけてるところだから。
Now, I personally love the way Subaru is written. He's someone I actually came to understand and sympathize with very well. His story shows a great deal of growth and a high level of detail and nuance for a subject that I personally find very compelling. He's someone who does the pathetic protagonist thing really well, in my opinion, and whose character arcs across the first 2 seasons were really well constructed. And again, people disagree with me on this one. I don't know why. Like, my opinions are always the correct ones, so don't disagree with me ever. Subaru is one of those notorious protagonists who gets a lot of flack for being generally simpy and annoying. He's obsessed with this girl named Amelia for seemingly no reason. He spends a lot of his time trying to get her attention, and he does a whole lot of whining about how he can't do all this stuff on his own. And the examples of this would be his general behavior in Season 1 and his particularly cringeworthy stretch where he goes on his ego trip in the capital. But this is all yet again a huge distraction from what the character actually is once you put it under a closer inspection. Subaru is someone whose quote-unquote simping is driven by a much deeper flaw. One that leads this character to have a resolution that properly handles the idea of protagonist growth that many stories with deeply flawed and unlikable protagonists seem to largely overlook by making theirs mostly complete and not acknowledging the flaws. You see, the true nature of his critical flaw is that he has no sense of self-worth. You don't really get to the heart of it until you get to Season 2, when, in the midst of the witch's trial, we're introduced to his backstory and how he grew up. It turns out his father was a fairly exceptional person, and Subaru grew up in the man's shadow. Just keep in mind, though, that the version of Subaru's parents we meet is something created by Echidna out of the memories and perceptions Subaru has of them. This could be very biased information, and they could be completely different people altogether in reality, but this is the version of them we're shown and the version of them that Subaru believes them to be. As a child, he was fairly exceptional himself based on nothing more than natural talent, but that didn't last very long and he soon faded from the limelight. However, Subaru had already grown dependent on the praise of others and the attention he received, and when that faded, he started to act out in hopes of standing out, going so far as to be a general public nuisance to try to make a place for himself and to get the recognition he craved. But all that did over time was make people avoid him because he was the problem child of the community. Even in high school, when he tried to turn over a new leaf, he still failed to find a place for himself to fill that need to belong. And that resulted in his constantly skipping school until we get to the very beginning of the series, where he gets isekai'd. This is the part of Subaru that manifests his very cringy and attention-seeking personality. All he wants is to belong to something. He wants to be important, or at the very least to know his life matters to someone. But his sense of self has become so distorted that he only sees value in what he can do for others and how much help he can provide. Put another way, he sees himself as below everyone else, and the only thing that can rectify that in his mind is if he were to bear the burdens and to do something significant for them. He will gladly push himself beyond his own limits in order to try to prove to people he's of value to them. The first example of this behavior that comes to mind is during Arc 2, or the Shaman Arc. The primary example of how he stacks up to the people around him is how useless he proves to be compared to the Oni twins, Rem and Ram. More often than not, he was a hindrance to them, and throughout the arc he continues to try to prove his worth while bearing the burden of his secret power, and that takes a mental toll on him. Eventually he breaks down and becomes physically sick from the stress that repeatedly failing to gain the approval of the maids puts on him. In multiple cases during this arc, it's Rem who ends his life, which adds an extra bit of salt to his wound as it shows him just how inadequate he really is in spite of his best efforts. There's a lot more to reinforce this idea, some stemming directly from the very nature of his power, but right out the gate in the first arc, we get to see just how feeble he really is on his own, or at least how the story reinforces that point. Subaru notes in the final loop of Arc 1 that Amelia arrives at Old Man Rom's bar faster than when she had accompanied Subaru around the city in the first part. It's a subtle point, but it's important to understand Subaru is trying to be of value to her in some way only to realize he failed and held her back. Add that to the fact that you gave a man who sees little to no value in himself an ability that reinforces the fact that his usefulness is in death, not life, and it seems like an extra bit of tragic storytelling. Another example is the very painful to watch return to the capital. In this, Subaru is told to stay out of the meeting of the royal selection candidates, but finds his way in by tagging along with Priscilla Burial and Aldebaran. In doing so, he bears witness to the harsh treatment Amelia receives for being a half-elf and tries to interject himself into the political process, causing a scene that results in what is effectively nationwide embarrassment, a severe beating at the hands of Julius Jaculius, and ultimately forming a rift between himself and Amelia. Subaru's ego and his desperation to be of service to the one person who seemed to acknowledge him as something worth her time drives him to make a reckless decision in jumping to Amelia's aid when she never asked for it and showed no need of it, and had specifically warned him not to attend the event, likely because of that. Later on, when she scolds him for disobeying her order to stay out of it all, he becomes enraged and tries to state that he did it all for her sake, and that she should be grateful for everything he does for her. The irony of this situation is twofold here. Firstly, he's being driven by his own selfish need to feel important to people and doesn't see it. Second of all, he's putting Amelia down into his place to try and elevate himself up, doing the opposite effectively of what he wants to accomplish. It's a great show of how immature and childish he really is, being given to his emotions so much that he would fail to see that he is the opposite of what he wants to be. And I am not kidding when I say Subaru was truly malevolent in this case, hating everyone around him because he is so stuck on the supposed righteousness of his actions. He has warped his own view of the situation just to protect himself. And it's not until much later, when Subaru is training with Wilhelm van Astrea, that he's actually confronted and challenged on the issue of his motivations and pride. This is where he's asked to look at himself and think about who he's really doing all these things for. And Wilhelm points out that all of his efforts to learn swordsmanship are purely to make himself feel better, to feel like he was actually doing something rather than for the sake of being beneficial to others. It's a point to be made about how his desire to be of use and to prove his worth had nothing to do with any good intention, and everything to do with his own ego, and that this was the reason for his lack of advancement. And this can be applied to how he behaves towards the challenges he faces during that loop. Up to this point in the arc, his attempt to defeat the witch's cultists had been based on him using his own ability or tagging along with Rem because of that need to prove his value, and because in his mind he needs to come to Amelia's rescue because it would prove her wrong. He is convinced that he is the only reason that everything works out, and that his ability alone is the linchpin to everything that happens. He isn't so much focused on saving her as he is validating himself in the position of her protector that he placed himself in. Eventually, he tries desperately to plead with people without seeing the real issue, only to realize how little sway he has with words alone, and be rejected by each and every one. Again, his attempt here had less to do with his will to save Amelia and more to do with his will to prove her wrong and himself right in the notion that he is the only good thing that has happened to her and the only one that can save her. The resolution to this is to finally put that ego aside and to do what needs to be done to recruit the help he requires. Ultimately, he is forced to choose between the self-centered and self-seeking desire to be solely victorious on his own merits, the idea that he has to be the star and that he was the one who needed to be the savior, or to acknowledge his flaws and compensate for them with the aid of others. And by extension, admitting that he is not the only thing standing between Amelia and her doom, and that he was wrong to appoint himself her protector, and that his mentality would ultimately drive her into more isolation. And this resolution will be reflected later on in the story too, when it comes to his imminent dealings with the Archbishop of Greed. And this is the marker of the turning point for his character. The resolution to the arc is Subaru accepting that there is a limit to what he can do, but there is always a hope, and that he will ultimately need the help of those more powerful than him to bring about the desired results. which means he is no longer the knight in shiny armor who comes to the rescue. He has to sacrifice his selfish request of being solely responsible for a glorious victory in order to save Emilia, and to finally do things with the actual intent of saving people he cares about. And ironically, by choosing this path, he does get his serious hero moment. But this turn is only one of the major points of his character. It isn't until Season 2, where Echidna lays bare the reason Subaru behaves the way he does, that we get the turning point that really matters. At this point, Subaru is still trying to throw his own life at the wall, hoping that it might change the course of events because he still sees little value in it. As long as he can use Return by Death, there's no point in clinging to life because he can simply reset and try again. And to that extent, it becomes a crutch for him, an easy excuse to give up. He may hate the idea of dying, but the idea has been put into his head now that he isn't yet cut out to be the savior of all, so the only thing he has up his sleeve is Return by Death. For all the manipulation she had hoped to use against him, Echidna did help Subaru come to terms with its inner demons. Through the reflection of his memories created by Echidna as part of the witch's trial, he's able to reconcile with the false sense that he had to live up to the expectations of others placed on him because of who his father was, and the idea that he somehow had to be equal to everyone, including the greatest out there. On top of that, he's shown the possibility that his powers may not reset the timeline, but throw him into an alternative one altogether. And Echidna uses this theory to show him that the alternative worlds he might have potentially left behind were worse off in the wake of his death. Ultimately, he's presented the fact that his life is his own, and that he can only really be himself, and that he should use each one with the intent of victory. The idea that Return by Death would always be there to save him had held him back from using his life to the fullest and finally accepting that there are things that he can do other than just throw it all away until he wins. And that results in his bet with Roswaal, a battle between a couple of clowns, tossed around by fate. And that's the point that Subaru fully acknowledges that the idea of being able to just abandon all and reset was holding him back. And that treating his life as worthless just because of the power he'd been given was a fatal flaw in how he perceived things. He finally decided that rather than just trying to rely on Return by Death to do anything, he should use every moment in his life to fight for what he wants to accomplish. So he uses it to bring all his pieces into line just in time to have his final round against the all-seeing Tome of Wisdom and the manipulative hand of the man wielding it. His story is no longer about how he can continue to throw his life away repeatedly in order to achieve results. It's about how he can live for those around him and do all that is within his ability to protect them, and repeat that over and over again. And ironically, it's this kind of behavior that earns Subaru the most praise and admiration. It was never grand conquests or his unyielding spirit as perceived by others, but the fact that he was able to bring together so many people to accomplish great things that made the likes of Julius, Reinhardt, Wilhelm, Krusch, and Anastasia evaluate him so highly. He may be feeble alone, but his ability to bring people together makes him outstanding, something kind of in line with his name. Ultimately, him finding a place to belong and living for the sake of those around him was a very good resolution in many of the negative aspects of his character. He may not match up to all the people around him, like Reinhardt, or even some of the Royal Selection candidates, but he still plays a very important role in the series of events. His flaws are yet again intentional, so that the character can grow and overcome in a way that the audience can actually appreciate. Subaru, after all of the events I've described above, does go on to try and develop himself more so that he doesn't have to rely on the powers of Return by Death constantly. And those skills do come in handy a good bit, even though he still pales in comparison to the threats he will have to come to face in the next season.